Let's go back to FAME. I know you've done a lot of work over the years, and I'm interested to talk a little bit about what you've done with the unions, trying to convince the labor unions that this present monetary system is stacked against blue-collar or middle-class workers. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, it's stacked against all workers.
Well, true.
It's stacked against ordinary people. And
middle class.
Pardon me?
The middle class of America.
Yeah, anybody who works for a living who produces something, as opposing to being part of the financial sector where they're passing paper around. And my thought at the time was that if we're going to change the system, we're going to need legislation. And in order to get legislation done in the United States, you need to have lobbying, which means somebody has to pay the lobbyist. Well, who is that going to be? Well, it's certainly not going to be the financial guys. I mean, their bread is buttered with the irredeemable paper ticket money. And as far as big industry is concerned, to a large extent, they've been co-opted. So people who run major companies, publicly traded companies, their principal focus are their options. And they sort of recognize instinctively that the money creation, the expansion of the money supply helps their options. And in their defense, they get these jobs when they're in the mid-60s. They only got a couple of years till mandatory retirement comes. And their focus is on making their options good. I've made presentations to some of the very top people in the country, the very top people. And one of them, I don't want to mention his name, it's embarrassing, I think, to him. I get all done. He says to me, yes, Larry, he says, this is a problem. It's going to have to be changed, but not on my watch. The labor guys have a history, on the other hand, of supporting honest money. So if you go back, say, to the 19th century, this was a big issue for labor right from the get-go. So the first labor union, one of the very first labor unions, the first major union, was the Typographers Union, formed in 1832. And the guy who headed it, his name was Ellie Moore. He was the first labor guy to go to the Congress. This was his issue. And people in those...
Sound money, so that his workers wouldn't be cheated by paper inflation or anything of that nature.
Well, it wasn't inflation. What happened is that workers were paid in paper money, and by the time they redeemed the paper money, it was discounted.
Ah, I see.
Okay, so there were three stools, three issues that got people to join unions in those days. One was the 10-hour workday, education for workers, and what they called honest money. And they had these buttons that said honest money. And like I said, Ellie Moore was the first labor leader to go to the Congress. He was a staunch supporter of Andrew Jackson, who, as you know, is very much in favor of gold. And even throughout the 19th century, this was a continuing issue for them. At the end of the 19th century, they railed against legal tender. I mean, these people knew what they were talking about, and they raised the exact right questions. They said, if the money's good, why do you have to force people to use it? Legal tender forces you to move.
Right.
And if it's not good, why should you force people to use it?
Right, because it wouldn't be honest in that case.
Exactly. And they had a line which I love. They said, gold is the standard of every great civilization. So if you look at any civilization that's prospered, they always had gold as money. They always had sound money.
This was accepted pretty much across the board by all labor unions in the 19th century?
This was the position of the American Federation of Labor.
Which was the biggest one?
That was the biggest one. That was Samuel Gompers.
Yeah.
And these quotes that I'm telling you about, these were printed in something called the American Federationist, which was the house organ from the American Federation of Labor. And nothing gets into the house organ that doesn't have the approval of the leadership. This was their position. They were, in the election of McKinley versus William Jennings Bryan, the unions were pro-gold. They wanted gold. So they wanted to make sure that they're going to get paid properly.
Yes.
So they had this legacy. In the 20th century, especially during the Great Depression, they lost sight of this. In their defense, labor was decimated during the Great Depression. And so there's a guy here in New York, his name was Sidney Hillman. He'd come from Lithuania. He headed something called the Ladies Garment Workers Union. They lost 90% of their workers, 90% of their members. And this is before women went into the labor force. So when the guy lost his job, that meant the whole family had no income coming in. And you had all these bank closings and bank failures. When the Bank of the United States, this was a regional bank here, not like in the 19th century, sort of like National Westminster. It's a major bank. When that bank failed in 1930, 450,000 workers, each of whom had less than $1,000 on deposit, lost their savings. So in one shot, they lost their savings, lost their jobs. Now what? And Hillman got into bed with Roosevelt. And really, that's what happened. It's been downhill since. Today, they don't know anything about this history. They see what's happened. They realize there's something wrong. but they haven't really come up with the right solutions. Just recently, I had an unhappy experience. There's an important labor journal which I solicited to do a article which I wrote. It's called "Cheating Public Workers Out of Their Pensions." And I liked the article. I showed it around to a lot of people before I submitted it, and it got rejected. And the reason it got rejected, the rejection letter I got, is that they had shown it to 3 readers, each of whom was an economist. And they came back and they said, well, the gold has been rejected both on the left and on the right, and goodbye and good luck. And that's what happened. Meanwhile, the guys from the building trades, this is a building trades button, it's Local 46, they've given me some good conversation. And the labor movement, as you may know, in America is demographically an older crowd. And they're concerned about their pensions, and they're not protected. Overall, pensions in the United States have, in the aggregate, I'm guessing something on the order of $15, $16 billion worth of gold, if that. There's a guy, I don't know if you know of him, Sean McGuire. Do you know who he is?
Yeah, at the University of Texas teachers.
That's the guy. He gave this really terrific presentation at the London Bullion Market Association a couple of months back, and he had a chart there showing pension participation with gold, and it's nothing. And what happens is these pension funds, they get advice from the consultants. The consultants are Wall Street guys. Wall Street guys do not want you to invest in gold. And the reason is the Wall Street guys are in it for the fees. And if you buy gold and take delivery, where are the fees? Yeah. So they have a conflict of interest. You know, on the working side, they're not really in control of this. It's always the management. It's very, very difficult to do.
How do you see this playing itself out over the next couple of years?
Well, it's already been a disaster, and millions of workers have lost their pensions. Airline workers, steel workers, textile workers, I mean, you name it, auto workers, and they really have no recourse as a practical matter.
And the purchasing power for even those that still have pensions is being eroded because of inflation and not being able to generate interest, for example, on a bank deposit that keeps up with the inflation rate.
Isn't that outrageous?
Yeah.
And so this business of, you know, people come down on Bernanke and they say, well, he's doing this QE2 and lowering the interest rates to zero. It's not helping the economy. That's spin. That's really not their purpose. Yeah. And Greenspan let the cat out of the bag years ago when he spoke about replenishing the balance sheets of the banks. So people think, you know, if you lower interest rates, it doesn't lower interest rates for you and me. I mean, your credit card, that interest rate doesn't get lowered. You go to get a mortgage or something, unless you're in some very favored class, you don't get some kind of reduction. The interest rate gets lowered for the banks. So the banks don't have to pay any interest. They are the largest debtors in society. Mm-hmm. And so really the interest that would normally go to savers, also on treasury bills and whatnot, it's going to the banks. It's out and out wealth transfer.
Yeah, it's pretty outrageous.
I call it stealing from the poor to give to the rich.
Mm. You're not alone in doing that. I think there's a groundswell of people who think exactly the same thing.
I wish we could bring these people up the learning curve, you know, on the money issue, you know, and how this happened. So if these folks had gold in their savings, they would not be at risk.